When my friend Nisimi is on reserve duty in the Israeli army, no one ever wants to see him. That's because his job is to be a casualty informer, the person who knocks on the door, bringing news of the unfathomable. How do you even deliver the message? I ask him. We speak the bare truth, and we carefully memorize every word, he answered. We are not allowed metaphors like, he's fallen, he's in the hands of the Creator. We say, we found him dead. He was killed in battle. When I listen to Nisimi, I remember honesty is compassion. It mitigates the inevitable disbelief and denial. Nisimi knows that he is delivering the most devastating news that a family will ever hear, and that he cannot prevent the anguish. The grief is necessary. There is no way around it, he said. My job is to sit with them in the unbearable sorrow, to prevent any more pain, and to stay with them until the community steps in and takes over. This accompaniment is not just for a few hours. He is there from the moment of notification through the end of Shiva for every single death. That is the protocol. Even secular families who want nothing religious in their funerals will still sit for 7 days. It's so Jewish. Our tradition understands that we need mechanisms for mourning that will hold us up, encourage us to grieve, surround us in community, and teach us to have a living relationship with our dead. As you can imagine, after October 7th, Nisimi's already difficult job became nearly impossible. He wasn't sleeping, barely eating. But his work has changed him. It's put what is most essential into hyper-focus, as if the world was suddenly and newly in technicolor. Francis Weller, a wise grief psychotherapist, described, there is some strange intimacy between grief and aliveness, some sacred exchange between what seems unbearable and what is most exquisitely alive. I saw this aliveness on my 3 trips to Israel of the past year. Despite all the trauma and the sorrow, I was astounded by Israelis' grit, passion, and generosity, and how much more comforting it felt to be there than here. They learned how to make grief their companion, to build memory into the fabric of society. Nisimi said that for most Israelis, Memorial Day is even more sacred than Yom Kippur. Now contrast that to the culture we have here in America. Memorial Day is for barbecues and appliance sales. And have you noticed? No one says the D word anymore. Instead, we say someone passed, departed, expired. A #1 best-selling book of the last year was entitled Outlive. There's an entire industry profiting on outsmarting mortality and distancing us from death. In the 1950s, 90% of Americans died at home. But by 1990, 80% of us died outside our home, in institutions. Death has become increasingly private and unseen. We hide it and hide from it, hoping it won't find us. So when death inevitably comes, we are taken so totally by surprise. We treat sorrow like a contagious disease, and we don't want to draw close. We diminish bereavement, allowing ourselves mere days to mourn. We fear memory, even uttering the name, lest it trigger the pain. But what happens if we don't get to properly mourn? When there's no ritual closure, when we don't allow ourselves time to digest our loss, or the community around us ignores or denies our grief, then loss becomes a trauma, an exile, a wound that cannot heal. For many of us, this was our experience after October 7th. We were mourners in limbo. As we learned more and more about the magnitude and the brutality of the massacre, it was nearly impossible to absorb the event. And within days came shocking denial and blame from so many corners, deafening silence from our friends and allies that only magnified our isolation. There was no time to grieve as we turned our attention to hundreds of hostages in captivity and to a war in Israel. Some of us also wept for the loss of lives in Gaza, and some of us didn't, causing ruptures in communities and within families. I knew that this Rosh Hashanah, I needed to begin with our grief and address the heaviness that each of us carry into this sanctuary. This year, I buried the parents of two of my closest friends. I co-officiated the funeral of a sparkling 28-year-old who died just as he shared his plans to propose to the love of his life. I have beloved congregants who are facing a terrifying diagnosis, a divorce they never wanted, the loss of a job. I've spoken to so many of you about your existential loss of safety and security as a Jew in America. Tonight, as we called in the new year with that first tekiyah, the shofar sounded like a collective wail for a grief that leaves no one untouched. But tomorrow, as we begin this reset, we will hear the ram's horn 3 more times, and each section of the shofar service will help us walk forward, teaching us the 3 essential elements for moving through loss: acceptance, remembrance, and revelation. The first section of the shofar service, Malchuyot, is translated as sovereignty. Put another way, I'm God and you're not. It illuminates the first step of bereavement, acceptance. When Jews learn of a death, the traditional response is Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. Blessed is the true judge. Those can be very difficult words to say, especially in the face of a tragic loss. But it forces us to humbly acknowledge that when it comes to death, we are not in charge. How fitting that during the main prayer of the Malchuyot section, the Grand Aleinu, we prostrate ourselves all the way down to the ground. Isn't that what the death of a loved one should do to us? Bring us to our knees. We're accustomed to being in control, to having polite feelings, but grief can be wild, raging. Francis Weller wrote, "I've heard how fearful people are of dropping into the well of grief. The most frequent comment is, if I go there, I'll never return." What I found myself saying back to them was rather surprising. If you don't go there, you'll never return. And how can we support someone we know and love who is grieving? Let them go there. There's a story from the Talmud when Rabbi Yochanan's son died. His friends think the best way to console him is by sharing stories of biblical figures like Adam, Aaron, and Job, who also all lost children. Yochanan's response to these words of comfort was essentially, "This is not helping." Rabbi Yochanan lived 2,000 years ago, but well-meaning people still do the same thing today. In an effort to connect, empathize, cheer us up, they'll remind you that everyone has suffering. Or they'll tell you about theirs, saying, "I also lost my dad. I know exactly how you feel. My sister also had that disease, and she's all better now." But a mourner in pain feels like no one could possibly hurt like they do. It's a heartache that is all theirs. Don't move immediately to assurances that they will be all right. Instead, hold them in their sorrow for as long as it takes, so that one day they can be all right. Rob Delaney, a comedian whose 3-year-old son died, said of the people who walked him truly through his agony, "They don't have to say anything. But if they sit there and keep eye contact with you and don't hold their breath and let it in, then you can move through it. And then you could talk about what to order for dinner." The world is full of beautiful and devastating things. We cannot experience our full humanity if we do not allow ourselves to feel all of it, and sometimes to be brought to our knees. But we do not remain there. The second section of the shofar service, Zichronot, Remembrance, is the next essential element of mourning. The shofar service speaks of how God remembers each one of us, and that remembering is itself an act of love. After her mother died, my friend committed to the traditional Jewish practice of saying daily Kaddish for a year. When she traveled, she found minyanim in France, Israel, Michigan. It took effort and some compromises, but she felt that it was appropriate, even good, that it wasn't always convenient. She connected to this ancient practice, felt the support of Jewish communities that she didn't even know, and carved out a moment every day to remember her mom. I spoke with a couple who lost their tender-hearted musical son, Alex, when he was just 16. A few months after his death, they started donating regularly to organizations and causes that Alex would have loved and supported. Each gift in his name was another opportunity to remember their son and share his story. They've been doing it now for over 30 years. Someday, they said, when we leave this earth, we will meet up again with Alex. And we want him to be proud of what we did in his name. Burial, funeral, shiva, shloshim, unveiling, yartzeit, yizkor. Judaism instructs us to build monuments of memory together for each of our loved ones. The power of rituals like these is how they create a space for remembering, but they are also contained, bounded. The concern that we will get lost in grief is real. Our tradition guards against unlimited mourning, which pulls us out of the world indefinitely. After a year, our tradition gently reminds us that it is time to move to a new stage of memory. The third section, Shofarot, Revelation, speaks of how God was once revealed to us in thunder, lightning, shofar, and is still being revealed to us today. And I've learned that this also happens with our loved ones who have died. Their reverberations echo back to us in surprising ways, beckoning us to sense them in our lives even after they're gone. Last January, I got a call out of the blue from Rabbi Delphine Herveleur, a French rabbi who interned at Central 15 years ago. Angela, the strangest thing happened to me. I got an email from Rabbi David Ellenson. Rabbi Ellenson had served as president of Hebrew Union College during our time in seminary, and he was a cherished teacher and mentor to both of us. The thing was, he had died a month earlier, in December. "Are you sure it was from him?" I asked her. "What did it say?" "It was a beautiful note," Delphine described. "He wished me mazel tov on my last book and told me how proud he was of my rabbinate." She stopped, full of emotion. I had been feeling so bereft after he died. His death was so sudden. "So," I asked her, "what did you do?" "I wrote him back." Now, whether this email ended up in her inbox through a mystical contact from beyond the grave or due to some technical glitch, Delphine knew better than to waste the opportunity. She shared her gratitude with her dear rabbi and found great comfort in knowing that her relationship had not ended with his death. I think of Rachel Goldberg-Polin, whose son Hirsch was brutally executed by Hamas after surviving for nearly 11 months in the tunnels of Gaza. At his funeral, she began her eulogy remarkably with words of gratitude to God. Rachel ended by speaking to her beloved Hirsch directly. "I will love you and I will miss you every single day for the rest of my life. But you are right here. I know you are right here. I just have to teach myself how to feel you in a different way." How do we teach ourselves to do that? We've actually been learning it all our lives. When we are infants, it takes many, many months before we understand that our mother still exists when she is just out of sight in another room. When we are children, we learn that a parent is still there for us, even if they are at work all day long. As adults, we can hear the advice a loved one would give us before we even pick up the phone. And once they've died, well, they're still right here. We just have to teach ourselves how to feel them in a different way. Rosh Hashanah, with its recounting of the creation story, reminds us that each new year holds the possibility of rebirth. And Yom Kippur, with its dreaded knock on the door, comes to notify us with the bare truth. We all lose everything we love. We must accept that grief is a fundamental experience of being human. It's a reflection of deep love. If we allow grief to be our companion and our community holds memory alongside us, we can find our love deepened, maybe even transformed, and our hearts awakened to the beauty that endures. I'm often asked, what happens to people after death? I do not have a definitive answer. Some religions do. Judaism does not. But we do believe that while bodies die, souls remain. Just as energy can never be created or destroyed, the life force that animates us when we're alive does not get extinguished when we die. It's just transformed. When we hear the shofar bring in this new year, its blasts will be fleeting. But the sound waves will resonate long after, vibrating within us, calling us to return, to acceptance, to mourning, to memory, to life.